and the peace of the Holy Spirit. This morning, we're beginning a new sermon series focusing on the parables of Jesus. And if you've been around the church for a little while, most of these teaching stories of Jesus are really familiar. Maybe you've heard them since you were a child. A lot of them have even kind of entered into our popular culture, common metaphors or phrases that just kind of seep into the world around us. But as simple and familiar as these stories usually are, there's more to them than meets the eye. These stories usually stumped Jesus' listeners and even his disciples. They often were a bit mystified or struggled with misunderstanding what it was that Jesus was getting at. So as we step into these parables, it can take a little bit of imagination to see them with fresh eyes, to hear them as the disciples may have heard them. So we're going to take a moment, and we're actually going to take a moment to kind of let your imaginations come forward. So try to get those creative juices flowing here. In our parable this morning, it's one of the most familiar, I think. And as I was thinking about it, I'm not sure I've actually heard a sermon on this as an adult. I'm not sure I've gotten any teaching about this parable as an adult. Usually it's taught to our children. It's in children's Bibles and Sunday songs, but we usually fail to give it another look, a closer look. But as I thought about it, I found the parallel between children's stories and parables uniquely appropriate. Both are very simple on the surface, but there's more depth, there's richness and complexity in them that we might not see right away. We have to take time to sit with them in order to really hear what they have to say. And we're bad at this, aren't we? I know I sometimes am, and I think especially as an adult. We suffer from what I like to call a critical lack of imagination. I think we kind of want the Cliff's Notes version, right? Do you guys ever have those in school, like the shortened bullet point version? What is this about? Distill it down for me. Tell me, what is the point? But if you read a story to a child, they construct an entire imaginative world. And when you're an adult, you just outline it. You want the basic points. But the stories of Jesus, the parables of Jesus, they, like the stories of our childhood, kind of sink down into us and begin to shape the way we see the world. They shape the language we use. They even shape our imaginative landscapes, the way we experience the world around us. As a lot of you know, this week as a community, we suffered the loss of a beloved member. And her name is Sarah Jordheim, and she was an artist. And I think as I was preparing this sermon, it struck me how well Sarah embodied this imaginative way of experiencing God. She was so open to the work of God and the world around her, so keenly aware of the beauty of God and creation. And as any of you who've spent time with her or seen her work will know, she found beautiful, gorgeous ways of embodying this perspective through art. And her work as an art therapist drew everyone around her into this search for God's loving and healing presence in our lives and in the world around us. So as we hear this simple parable, it's only 4 short verses, I ask you to enter into it with fresh eyes and a bit of imagination, the posture of a child, with a posture like Sarah's. So let's hear together Luke chapter 6, verses 46 to 49. If you haven't already, feel free to get up. Now's a good time to grab a sermon handout or a Bible. We're going to be hanging out in Luke chapter 6, so I promise I won't be offended if you get up there on a cart at the back there. And it will also be up on the screen behind me. So this is Luke 6, starting at verse 46. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I tell you? I will show you what someone is like who comes to me, hears my words, and acts on them. That one is like a man building a house who dug deeply and laid the foundation on rock. When a flood rose, the river burst against that house, but could not shake it because it had been well built. But the one who hears and does not act is like a man who built a house on the ground without a foundation. When the river burst against it, immediately fell, and great was the ruin of that house. I think our big temptation with this story is to assume it's really straightforward. We read it and we're like, got it. I totally understand everything about it. Our shorthand version, you can tell me if you have experienced this similarly, it usually goes something like this. Faith in Jesus is the foundation of your life. If he is, you'll be safe and secure from any storm. If he's not, your life is vulnerable to total destruction. Boom, done. Got it. Close the book. Faith equals a safe, well-built house. Lack of faith, we kind of envision as a rickety shack. And this is the shorthand we usually teach our kids too, right? But is it true? Is that actually what this passage is saying? Is that what it's really about? So let's press in a little closer. We're going to start by taking a look at verse 47, where Jesus says, I will show you what someone is like who comes to me, hears my words, and acts on them. There's a little progression that Jesus lays out here. He says, come, hear, and act. I think we usually forget that this parable comes at the end of a sermon. So Jesus has been teaching a group of actual people standing in front of him. And this is the way he ends. These verses are his concluding story. Jesus comes down from praying on a mountainside, and in verse 17 of this chapter, he's teaching a diverse group of people from all around the region, both his disciples and people who are just curious to know who this guy is and what he has to say. These people were told they have come to hear him and to be healed of their diseases. So according to the progression that Jesus lays out in verse 47, these people, they've already come and they were eager to hear and be healed. But then the next step that Jesus lays out for them is to act on what they have heard. And this is where Jesus brings in the parable of the two builders. So I wonder why we're so eager to assume that the action Jesus is talking about, that's illustrated by this kind of metaphor of building or digging a foundation, is simple faith. Jesus doesn't say believe, he says act. We're supposed to act on his words. And I think this actually makes a lot of sense with the illustration of digging a foundation, building a house. That's really active work. But if it's not just belief, if it's not just believing in Jesus that he's talking about here, then what is the work that he means? What is the work that he's asking us to participate in? And I think this is where we have to remember again that he's at the end of a sermon. So in order to kind of get an idea of what that action might be that he's talking about, we kind of have to go back and see what else he said to the people. So let's take a look and see what he might have to say. He says in verses 20 and 21, "Blessed are you who are poor, who are hungry, who are weeping. Blessed are you when people hate you, when they exclude you and insult you and reject your name as evil because of the Son of Man." A little later on, he says, "Woe to you who are rich, who are full, who are laughing." He asks in verse 27, he says, "Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who abuse you." Verse 35, "Love your enemies, do good, and expect nothing in return." He says, "Be merciful." He says, "Do not judge." Oh, that's not the picture that I had when I was little. I think, okay, you build the house, the foundation is faith, that's easy. You just believe in Jesus, boom, there you are. But I think all of that Jesus had just preached about, that sounds a lot harder to me. I don't know about you. And I think part of the reason we tend to shortchange a little bit the effort that's talked about in this parable. And I think part of the reason for that is because as modern people, we forget just how hard it is to build a house. I think we usually hire contractors when we have to build a foundation. There's usually some pretty heavy machinery involved, but that's not the kind of foundation building Jesus is talking about. Picture more yourself and a shovel. There's a really helpful commentary that kind of dives into some of the contextual details of what it was like to live in Israel, that gives us a little more of an imaginative window into what this looked like. So the Israelites, they usually only built in the summertime, in the dry season. And that, it's pretty clear why. Digging in the mud does not sound very fun. But they have a really high clay content in their soil. And I don't know if any of you have dug through clay anytime recently, but it is hard. Like this gets almost like as hard as rock. It seems pretty sturdy. And so imagine that is what you have to dig through to find the foundation. And the commentator, he actually went to Israel and he interviewed some villagers who still kind of build in a similar way. And he asks them, well, how far down do you have to dig? Like, where is this rock exactly? And they say, or like, when he asked how far down, they say, you have to dig down to the rock. That's their answer. How far? To the rock, obviously. It doesn't matter if it's 1 inch or 10 feet, you just have to keep going until you hit rock. Because if you build just on that clay, that hard clay that actually seems like it could hold quite a bit, the problem is the rainy season is going to come. The clay is going to soften. Then this house, you stack these stones and it's so sturdy, it looks so good. But then the clay softens. The walls start to buckle because the ground underneath it shifts. And then the house begins to collapse. I think this is where a little more imagination can really help us understand what Jesus is doing here. So get that visualization going. I want you to take a little journey with me. So I want you to picture yourself with a shovel in your hand. You're knee deep in hard red clay. It's hot. Like it's been a hot summer in Michigan. Picture it like just hot. The sun is pounding down on you. And you're just sweating. Sweat is pouring off your body. But I don't know if you've ever been really sweaty when there's, dust or powder or chalk, and it kind of coats you. Do you know what I'm talking about? Like it sticks to your sweat. So kind of envision that. Like you kind of have this chalky dust sticking to you. All you want to do is have a drink of water in the shade. You are hot. Your tongue maybe is sticking to the roof of your mouth. You really, really just want to stop working. But the thing is, you haven't hit rock yet. And you don't know exactly when you will. So you glance over at your neighbor, and she's already halfway through expertly piling stones to create the walls of her house. And you kind of start feeling these gnawing feelings, maybe some jealousy, some regret. Her house looks just like yours will, eventually. So you have a choice. You keep digging down, 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 until you eventually hit rock. Or you can start the much more gratifying process of building up walls. So what do you pick? It's a lot of effort. It's extremely difficult and dangerous. To come, to hear Jesus' words, and then to act is like this. It's like committing to dig a foundation by hand through clay until you hit rock that's suitable to build a foundation on. So I don't know about you, but that gives me a lot more sympathy for the builder who builds without a foundation. We kind of tend to parody them a little bit, right? Like I said earlier, we kind of think of it as a rickety shack. It's like obviously structurally unsound. It looks terrible. No one would want to live there. We kind of make a parody of what that looks like. Of course, you would build on the rock. But when you consider the commitment, the sacrifice, the pain involved in doing that, you start to understand a little more. Or at least I do. And when you consider the work that Jesus calls us to, of loving your enemies, of blessing those who curse you, extending mercy and compassion without expecting anything in return, it becomes a little easier to see why not everyone who heard Jesus had the stomach to follow it up with action. So I don't know what your vision of a well-built house looks like, but I love older houses, lots of character, wood floors, beautiful trim, the kind of craftsmanship you don't see every day. I also envision a place of rest, a place of security, a place of peace. And while I think Jesus uses the image of a house advisedly, we have to be really careful with the expectations that we import into this parable when we envision a well-built house. In our world, a home usually means stability. It means financial security. It means safety. And the more time I spent in this parable, the more I started to notice a real tension. Because the kind of actions that Jesus is calling us to seem to kind of clash a little bit with this picture of security. In the earlier part of the sermon, Jesus calls us not to financial security, but to generosity. He calls us not to erect walls of protection and exclusion, but to extend mercy, compassion, and love, even to our enemies. So I'm starting to feel like what Jesus is offering might not be exactly what we're expecting. And this was summarized really well for me. I found these words by he's an awesome guy named Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He's a theologian from this past century. And he says, the disciple is dragged out of his or her relative security into a life of absolute insecurity that is, in truth, into the absolute security and safety of the fellowship of Jesus. But the funny thing is, we actually can't do this without faith. I said earlier that, the foundation isn't just the simple faith in Jesus, but we also can't act without faith. Faith is, in fact, what it means to put all of your security into Jesus' hands. But Jesus is saying here that faith, it's not just like this intellectual belief. It's a life of actually trusting him, of being willing not only to come, to hear eagerly, but to begin to take action. But here's the thing. That's really hard, right? Really, really hard. And I want to say, if you're hearing me right now, and you kind of like the idea of taking active steps of faith, but you're not sure that you could possibly succeed because of how difficult this parable makes it seem, there is hope for you, for all of us. And that's because all metaphors, all parables, all images, you can only take them so far. They all have a limit. And here's the limit of this parables. We envision the builder alone, digging by himself, by herself. But the thing is, none of us are asked to do this work perfectly, and none of us are asked to do this work alone. We find in Ephesians 3:20 the reminder that Jesus is the one who, by the power at work within us, is able to accomplish abundantly more, far more than we can ask or imagine. And in Romans 8:11, we find the assurance that the same Spirit that raised Jesus from the dead resides in all of us who are digging a foundation in Jesus. The Spirit that defeated death is our comforter and our guide. We are not alone. We are not left to accomplish any of this in our own power. But Jesus' ministry does call us again and again and again into a paradoxical kind of life. We give away generously and trust in God's provision. We leave behind safety and security that we try to create for ourselves, and we enter into a very different kind of security and safety. We counter hatred and fear with love instead of self-protection. And I think we're offered a really beautiful image of this later on in the book of Luke in chapter 12. Jesus said to his disciples, "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, what you will wear. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothing. Consider the ravens, they neither sow nor reap. They have neither storehouse nor barn, yet God feeds them. Of how much more value are you than the birds? And can any of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your span of life? If then you are not able to do such a small thing as that, why do you worry about the rest? Consider the lilies, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin, yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not clothed like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass of the field, which is alive today and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, how much more will he clothe you, O you of little faith? For it is the nations of the world that strive after all these things, and your Father knows that you need them. Instead, strive for his kingdom, and these things will be given to you as well." It's a long passage, but I think it's a really important reminder. We have to hold that together with this image of being invited to act. Because our work, all of that effort and striving, they're not directed to our own ends, to our own safety and needs, but instead to the work of the kingdom. And in doing so, in the challenging, sacrificial action that Jesus calls us to, we find we're provided for. We find that we're secure. After all, I think what looks like security, what looks like comfort and peace, the parable tells us, often is not. The second builder, the one who builds without a foundation, probably had a house that looked a lot like the first builders, comfortable and snug. And it wasn't until the rains came that the underlying insecurity was revealed. And Jesus' language is really not subtle here. He says, when the river burst against it, immediately it fell, and great was the ruin of that house. This isn't like springing a little leak and like having to like patch here and there. It's great was the ruin of that house. So that's pretty dramatic. Without the rock foundation, to be fruitless, providing a lasting structure for the house. The house lacked structural integrity. It appeared to be solid, but it wasn't. And I think this contrast is made even more profound by Jesus' question in the first verse of our story, of our parable, in verse 46. He says, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I tell you?" And at first you're just like, it's easy to brush past that and get to the building part. That's the part we understand. But calling Jesus Lord is a really strong statement. He doesn't use the phrase teacher or swell guy or a great example. He says Lord. Now, if someone were to call Jesus Lord, what they're doing is they're declaring for Jesus a title of authority. If Jesus is Lord, if you call Jesus Lord, then you're framing yourself as his subjects. So saying that Jesus is in a position of authority in our lives, but stopping at just hearing his words, is a position that lacks a little bit of integrity. It's professing to be one thing, but not actually doing anything about it. And I think we do this all the time, right? And mostly in kind of subtle ways. I think of it as things like, I don't know, do you ever pat yourself on the back when you actually remember to bring a reusable bag to the grocery store? You're like, yes, I'm saving the planet. And not that those small things don't matter, but that's not enough, right? That's just the beginning. Or maybe we donate a few items of clothing that you haven't worn in like 3 years to someone who needs them, and you're like, yeah, that's great. But that's just the beginning, right? That's just a little bit. And I find it really helpful that the parable just before this one is the parable of the tree and its fruit, which sets us up really nicely to understand our parable a little better. So I'm going to read it really quickly. It says, "No good tree bears bad fruit, nor again does a bad tree bear good fruit. For each tree is known by its own fruit. Figs are not gathered from thorns, nor are grapes picked from a bramble bush. The good person out of the good treasure of the heart produces good, and the evil person out of the evil treasure produces evil, for it is out of the abundance of the heart that the mouth speaks." And I think the idea here is one that was really common in the ancient world, that character is revealed by action. The idea isn't that we really should be perfect, and if we're not, we're in trouble. Nor is the idea that we're like earning everything with our efforts. I think this pair of parables is saying something else. If your life is not starting to look like Jesus's, if we never take a step beyond just hearing his words, our faith has no foundation. We're invited to come. We're encouraged to hear, but then being asked to act. I don't know about you, but I don't think we're really living in a world that looks a lot like the Beatitudes that Jesus laid out earlier. I don't think the poor, the hungry, the weeping seem particularly blessed most of the time, at least not to me. And I certainly don't feel most of the time that those who are rich, full, and laughing are experiencing a lot of woe. They don't seem very woeful to me. So what do we do? Like, how do we press in to the picture of the world that Jesus begins to lay out for us here? What is it that we, as people who have come to seek this enigmatic Jesus, what is it that we are to do? Come, we hear, and then we act. We learn to love our enemies. We seek to extend the compassion and mercy of Jesus to those around us. We do our best to be people who do not judge others as if we are equipped to see everything clearly. We learn to take small steps, empowered by the Holy Spirit, to look like Jesus, our Lord. Thanks, Pete. So I have some practical tips for you. This should be up on the screen behind me here. And the first one, it's really simple. Act. Listen to the prompting of the Holy Spirit this week as you pray, and be prepared to take action, even if it's of the smallest kind, even if it's just kind of an internal shift in your heart. Smile at someone who you find really difficult, maybe. Spend a little money that you would normally use for something else to help someone who really needs it. And my second tip, if this feels impossible for you, this just feels completely overwhelming, you don't even know where to start, that's okay. So instead, I invite you to kind of imagine yourself as one of the crowd who's come to hear Jesus. If something in you is intrigued about what he has to say, but maybe you're not sure you're ready to follow. And just pray for Jesus to reveal himself to you in his incredible love and compassion. Because it's only when we have experienced this love that we are able to act in concert with it. And my third tip is to take a look at your spiritual practices. Like with anything, we don't experience growth and transformation like automatically. It takes practice. If our actions flow out of the treasures of our heart, then we have to learn to kind of cultivate this treasure, this good fruit. And I think that's where things like life groups, prayer, maybe spiritual direction come into play. If you don't have some of these practices in your life and you've been kind of feeling a need to grow or maybe a kind of stagnation in your growth, just maybe consider adding a new spiritual practice. I encourage you, though, not to just like leap in and try everything, but kind of wait for a nudge from God toward a particular practice that could be fruitful for you right now. As we conclude, I also want to invite all of you to know we have a prayer station off here to my left, your right. And if you just find yourselves heavy-hearted today for any reason, especially if you're grieving the loss of Sarah, or if you're in physical pain, or if anything is weighing on you, we have trained and compassionate people available to pray with you. And if you think that you could use a little extra follow-up, please let me know, because we, the pastoral staff here, would really love to walk with you. So now I'm going to hand it over to Sean.